Oasis. Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am Scott Allen, and thanks to my daughter Kate for developing the intro to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast, where we offer a smart, fast-paced discussion on all things leadership. My guests help us explore timely topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. If you haven't done so, please click subscribe so you automatically, seamlessly stay in the know when we publish new episodes. Likewise, please provide me with feedback. What do you like? What do you dislike? And what else would you like to know? Okay, today I have Ron Riggio, Henry R. Kravis Professor of Leadership and Organizational Psychology at Claremont McKenna College and the Kravis Leadership Institute. And Ron, I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you. When I think of each guest, I always kind of think of a few words that come to mind as I think about those individuals. And so as I was thinking about you today, 3 words that come to mind for me are friendly. You are just the friendliest individual at conferences, and it's always such a pleasure to bump into you and to say hello and to connect. And the second word I have is prolific, because you are prolific. You have been writing at an incredible pace for, I don't want to ask how long, but I imagine it's decades at this point. We're in the hundreds and hundreds of articles and book chapters. And then the third is music. Now we're connected on Facebook, and so you've been producing some clips on YouTube, and you've been introducing me to new music. So I thank you for that. And I didn't know that about you, that you're a music fan. I am as well. So I have friendly, I have prolific, and I have music. So those are do those 3 words? I don't know. Am I in the ballpark?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I really enjoy writing, so that that's part of that. And I have my blog, so that fills in the time when I'm not working on journal articles. As far as music, I'm a kind of a frustrated musician. My sister's a professional musician.
Really?
And yeah, so so I'm frustrated. I mean, I mess around with guitar and all that, but I really do love listening to music.
Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot here. A couple of the best concerts you've ever attended.
Oh, David Bowie, in around circa 1972, when he was
wow.
in the early days. Recently, The Who at the Hollywood Bowl with a full orchestra. I was very impressed with that.
Really? Oh, and they're still cooking, aren't they?
Yeah.
Well, at least 2 of the 4.
Yeah.
As we were planning for this conversation today, I was really excited because, again, because of the nature of the writing and the amount of writing that you do, I really wanted to ask you 2 questions, and they're kind of unfair in some ways, but I really do want to get your opinions. I mean, I asked you, I think the first question I was going to ask you was, what do you know to be true about leadership? And I'd just love for us to talk about 3 or 4, maybe we get to 5. But what do you know to be true about leadership? And so let's start there.
Okay. So let me start off first with this idea that, we are a very leader-centric culture. We sort of put our leaders on pedestals, and we focus so much on leaders. What we really know, the truth is this, that leaders don't do leadership, right? That leadership is co-created by leaders and followers working together. And so often in leadership, in research on leadership, or in the practice of leadership or leader development, we just focus on the leader and we leave the followers out of the equation. And we know that you've got to have both parties. This is a relationship, and it takes both people to create leadership. So that, I think, is something that we've sort of ignored the follower for a long time.
I just started class and I had them read some Joseph Rost, and so some of the work that he had done of moving from that kind of industrial paradigm of thinking about the great man or woman, but at the time it was the great man that they were writing when they first started researching the topic, right? So yes, it's a collaboration.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's first, and that, and maybe we'll come back to that about followership. Second truth that I think is important, and I think a lot of people sort of misunderstand this, is we equate effective leadership with good leadership. So we think if the leader gets things done, that's good leadership. And I want to separate those two constructs because effective does not necessarily mean good.
Okay.
So there are plenty of leaders who are effective, but could be better leaders. And in fact, there are some effective leaders who are very bad leaders. And so when I think about good, I think more about the sort of moral, ethical elements. And that's somewhat independent of effective.
Who comes to mind for you as you think about these two ways of thinking about it, the difference between effective and good?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you get to sort of classic work, and I've done some work on charisma and sort of charismatic leadership. So when we talk about that, well, we say, well, there are these charismatic world leaders that came on the scene, and we talk about the positive ones. And if we go to World War II, we think of Churchill and we think of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. Then eventually, in a talk about charisma, somebody mentions Hitler, and they say, well, Hitler almost took over the world. And so he was effective, and he obviously had charisma, and so they go down that path. But I think, as far as I'm concerned, Hitler's not a good leader. He may have been effective for a period of time, but not necessarily good. I mean, another example that I sometimes use, and I kind of do this cautiously, and he's also is no longer with us, but Steve Jobs. So
Okay.
Steve Jobs from Apple, very effective, right? I mean, under his watch, Apple came out with most of the products that we use all the time now, right? I mean, and he really changed the way we receive information, including music, right? The iPod was a transformational kind of thing. And, he was clearly effective. But reading about him and reading the biography of him, he also was somewhat of a tyrant, used bullying tactics and things like that. So I think that, yes, effective, but on the good level, there was something missing. Now clearly he's not of the, sort of bad, not like he's a bad person or anything like that, but he could have been so much better. Imagine if he would have really worked to develop his followers, if he would have treated them fairly, encouraged them rather than sort of browbeating them. If you think about that, with all of his effectiveness, we would probably canonize him. He'd be Saint Stephen today.
The Isaacson biography, and then I've watched some of the movies that have came out about him, and you're right. It's interesting because when he was fired from Apple the first time, he was prickly, he was cold, he was rigid. At least that's the lore around him. And you're right. That's a fun conversation that I'll go down the road with sometimes with my students. You have someone who, to your statement, bullied in many cases or lied in some instances. And so good leader, I don't know, effective, innovator, maybe, sure, right? Build the world's most valuable company. And I think that's confusing for people. I think that's really confusing for people.
Yeah. And so we do have to look at leadership on multiple levels. I mean, we have to, we can say, are they effective? But then were they good? And then we get into the whole ethics area, and that's always very, very complicated.
So what else? What else comes to mind? What other truths do you have?
Let me turn back to and put these two together and return to the follower. And so one of the things that's true is we really need to spend time better understanding followers and followership. And let me give you an example of a question that puts the two together is, why do people follow bad leaders? And that's a question we've been concerned with. And actually, just this week, we got a paper accepted, well, tentatively accepted. I don't want to jinx it. And what we did is we looked at why people might support a negative leader, a bad leader. So there's, and this relates to what we call implicit leadership theories. So there's a measure of implicit leadership theories. And one of the things that they found with this instrument is you basically say, what qualities do you admire in a leader? And there's a bunch of adjectives on this instrument. And most people say, I want somebody with integrity, and I want them to be supportive and, maybe at some level empathic, and all of these kind of positive traits. But a subset of people think that an ideal leader is self-centered, pushy, manipulative, And there's a cluster of these sort of more negative characteristics that, and this is maybe overblown, but they call it tyrannical leadership, right?
Okay.
So the idea is that there are these prototypical ones that most people believe in, which are the more positive characteristics, but there's a subset of people who support tyrannical leaders. They want their leader to be a tough guy, right? And this goes back to kind of maybe some of our evolutionary history of sort of support for alpha males, the strongest, the toughest, the meanest, that kind of thing. And so we were interested in this, and we thought, why would people do that? Why would people support a tyrannical leader? Because most of us think the more prototypical positive leaders. And so we have a longitudinal database where we can go back and we can study different aspects of these, well, children then, but now they're in their 40s. What we looked for was, okay, some of our participants in this research, this longitudinal research, actually support the anti-prototypical, the tyrannical leader. And so we looked at what happened during their youth that might be an indicator of why they support this, why they sort of or counter most everybody else. And one of the things that we found was that as adolescents, they grew up in very high conflict families.
Wow.
So so basically our thought here, and this is really conjecture because we don't know this for certain, but the thing that relates to it, that correlates with support for tyrannical leaders is a high conflict family. Now we're talking very high conflict families, right? Where there may actually be sort of physical, conflict. Now, if you think about it, and we know this, that when we think of early role models for kids, for leadership, they turn to their parents.
Yeah.
And so social learning theory says, well, we sort of model this. And so that, that's one sort of avenue. And then think of this, you're in a high conflict family with you're an adolescent and they're verbally aggressive or whatever, and maybe even physically aggressive. And it's kind of conflict, right? It's chaotic in that environment. And how does the parent get control of that environment? Well, they may really get tyrannical. They may knock some heads around, right? That kind of thing. And so what we're thinking is that might be the early roots of support for these negative leaders. And there's other reasons why. I mean, there's other theoretical approaches, and Jean Lippman-Blumen, as I do, and she argues too. Why would somebody support a bullying, tough guy leader? Well, because they're looking for the father figure, and she has that sort of psychoanalytic interpretation to it. And that's not inconsistent with what we're talking about. So I think that's really interesting. And one of the issues we have to deal with, and I think Jean Lippman-Blumen points this out, is sometimes the followers are worse than the leaders. And going back to Hitler, we can see that some of his inner circle were more dangerous and more destructive than he was himself.
What you just said made me think of an article. It might have been 88, around there, Kunert and Lewis, where they took the work of Keegan and Keegan's adult development theory. I'll send it to you, and I'll post it in the show notes. But basically looked at and tried to kind of overlay Keegan's work in adult development theory and the stages with leadership. And so it was a really interesting perspective, and I'd love to speak with Robert Keegan about this, because their assumption, their perception of someone who is at the imperial stage, for instance, would construct leadership in their head as this kind of tough, strong man, this, that, right, wrong, good, bad, kind of forceful figure. Now, someone working out of a higher level of development will see the system, will work out of a place of altruism, and they hypothesized in that article, if I'm remembering it correctly, was that it's going to be very difficult for someone who's at that level 4 or 5 in development to kind of communicate down to someone who's at that imperial level. And so it's just it's a fascinating topic, because you're exactly right. Why are people following? It could be out of fear. It could be that they believe in the mission. It could be that this is an archetype. I met a gentleman in France a year and a half ago, and he was a public defender in Georgia, and he'd become fairly widely kind of known for some of his work with gangs. And I said, well, tell me how leadership, we were having a breakfast together. And I said, well, tell me how leadership works in a gang. And he said, well, if you go out and do the work, then you rise through the ranks. And I said, well, what's the work? And he said, whatever the work is, you're known as someone who's going to go out and do it. And then maybe you'll become a double OG. And I said, well, who makes you a double OG? And he said, well, a triple OG. And I said, well, how do you, but in that context, that's leadership. That is, and that is the archetype, and that's what people follow and work toward, which is too bad, obviously, and of course, but fascinating conversation.
Yeah, and that's part of the issue around better understanding of followers and followership, because the stereotype is the sort of the sheep, right? Sort of blindly, willingly following the leader. And we know that that may represent some subset of followers, but there are many followers who are engaged and think creatively and think outside the box and try to influence leaders, and the influence goes both ways too. Again, remember, they're co-constructed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So leaders and followers together are causing leadership.
Well, and in Kellerman's book, was it Bad Leadership, where I liked how she broke it out, where she talked about the leader and then the followers and then the context. What was happening in the context that allowed Marion Barry to be elected multiple times? What was going on in Washington, D.C.? And who are these people around him that enabled some of this behavior? And so I think it's awesome. Such a fun, complex conversation. But I love what you're saying there, because I think I'd never thought of it that way, that we have to better understand what's happening for them. Because at least in my mind, when I've thought of fully engaged followers, I've always in my mind put a positive spin to that.
Mm-hmm.
But there are people who are fully engaged and all in, and they're not good.
Yeah. Well, so I think the last truth that maybe we can come up with some more, but I think we do know what leadership characteristics are important. I mean, I think there's this belief that it's so complex and that we don't really understand what makes a leader an effective leader, what makes a leader a good leader, so good and effective. And I think we really do know. I mean, I think we know that it's important to be focused. And this goes back to the behavioral stuff, right? It's important to get the task done. It's important to be focused on the task. It's important to be focused on relationships. And it's only going to be through fostering those relationships with followers that you're going to get things done. And, and then some of the other characteristics, if we talk about what makes a good leader, what makes a person of integrity, then I think we need to look at character and make sure that we're not only, selecting leaders of good character, but we're in many ways fostering the development of good character in everybody, in organizations, in both leaders and followers. We think about that a lot. We think about the leader's character and, what kind of leader am I? And very few people ever stop and say, well, what's about my followership characteristics? And what about me as a follower? And am I a good follower? Or am I just a blind follower? Or, and we're back into that discussion.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting. So what else would you say? Of course, we've got the task and we've got the personal or the relationship dimension. We've got character. Anything else that you would say we kind of know about what makes a good leader?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you want to have, a certain amount of technical competence. I think you want to, a good leader needs to be able to initiate creativity, be able to stimulate creativity. I mean, a lot of this now will go back to transformational leadership, right?
Sure.
So, and obviously Bernie Bass helped convert me to that kind of theoretical model. And, the idea, if you sort of I'll break down transformational leadership really quickly and say that it's a good model, may not be the only model or the best model, but it's a good model of what we would like in a leader. And so the first characteristic is idealized influence. We want you to be a positive role model, do the right thing, look like a leader, be somebody we want to follow. So that's idealized influence. We want you to be inspirational motivation. We want If we're followers, we want somebody who gets us excited about the mission of the organization, keeps us going, and inspires us in that way. Individualized consideration. We want a leader who's going to build a personal relationship with us and knows our needs, knows our strengths, but also knows our limitations.
Yes.
But we also want to be stretched if we're engaged followers, and that's the intellectual stimulation. So we want a leader who challenges us. And one of the things, go back to Steve Jobs, so I don't leave a horrible taste in people's mouths, but he was great at intellectual stimulation. He may have done it with a heavy hand, but he really did challenge his people to be creative.
Mm-hmm.
Those are 4 big characteristics, and we know those are associated with good leadership.
Yeah. So let's switch gears a little bit. So for individuals who are listening to this podcast and they are thinking about developing leaders, architects of programming, what are some truths that you have in that space?
All right. So leader development. So I think the first stage is really about our mindset. And so we need to ask a couple of questions. So now we're talking about leader development, and my colleague David Day drew distinctions between leader development and leadership development, as you know.
Would you share those really quickly, just so everyone knows?
Right, I will do that. So leader development is focusing on the individual development, focusing on the leader. Leadership development is focusing on developing the collective capacity of leaders and followers, the unit, the team, the department. And so really right now I'm focusing on leader development. And so this idea of when you start out, mindset is important. And you should ask yourself these questions. Why do you want to be a leader? Why do you even want to take on that role or develop as a leader? And we know there's different motivations for why people lead, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a good study by Chen and Drasgow, and they have a scale called Motivation to Lead scale, and they really talk about sort of 3 levels of leadership. While I really enjoy it, the affective part of it, I want to be a leader because I like being in charge. Another component is normative, is other people see me as a leader. And you often hear this with students. Well, why did you become a leader? Well, my classmates always said, you'd be a perfect leader, or, we see this with politicians, right? Somebody in the community, and people come up to them and say, you really should be our representative. And so that sort of thing. And then there's the, they call it non-calculative, but we can flip that around. Calculative part is, why do I want to be a leader? Well, because I realize leaders have a little more power. They sometimes have more wealth. They have more control. And so I'm calculating. I'm saying, it's better to be a leader than a follower. That's something that people should, think about. Second thing, and I'll steal this from my colleague Dave Day, who is really a leader development expert. He uses this analogy. I think it's a very good one, that leader development is like a gym membership, and so you can buy the gym membership, but if you don't work at it, you're not going to develop, right? And so that's the idea. So I think it's this: are you willing to work hard? Is the question you have to ask yourself. And so you have to have that mindset. Am I real? And it's just like anything, it's just like if you're trying to lose weight or you're trying to get in physical shape, you got to work hard. Or if you're a student, you've got to, why do I want to go to college, right? It's the same kind of thing. There's going to be hard work involved.
And I think at times, men and women are at work today, right now, forgetting that they could be working at it, forgetting that they could be practicing. They have a practice field 8, 10, 12 hours a day sometimes, but they're on autopilot and they're just moving through the day, and they aren't necessarily thinking of that as an opportunity to build their skill, to practice, whether that's emotional intelligence in these times especially, or inspirational motivation, to your point, with working with their teams, intellectual stimulation. What are we going to do? How are we going to shift? Where are we going to go next? So I think it's spot on. And I love the gym membership analogy. That's great. That's really great. Because I sat in a room, Peter Vail wrote a foreword to a book that I wrote once, and it was, I'm going to not say it correctly, the quote, but it was, an Achilles heel of leadership development is that no amount of sitting in a room talking about it helps people get better at the activity of leading others. And so I had a great conversation with Kay Anders Erickson a couple weeks ago around this notion of deliberate practice. And I know in the paper you just wrote with Susan Murphy, who I spoke with last week, you guys included deliberate practice. It's not something that just happens. You got to work at it.
Yeah. Well, that's good. And actually, that's probably that lifespan development paper.
It is.
Yeah. So
Great
that's
conversation.
actually my next thing in leader development, and she actually had this term take a long lens view
Mm,
of leader development. And we don't often think about leader development, and I would guess many of your listeners didn't even start thinking about developing as a leader until they got employed, until they got into maybe a supervisory position, right? I mean, unless you went through a leadership program in college or in high school or whatever. But for the most part, you really took it seriously when you were an adult. And the point that Susan and I were trying to make is that if we wait until we're adults to develop our leadership, that it's really too late, because this all starts very, very early. And then related to that, if we flip it around because both Susan and I are parents and we hope to develop our kids, what can parents do to develop their kids into leaders? And it doesn't have to be leader. It could be to be an exemplary follower too.
yeah.
Or it could just be, what can we do to create our children or help our children become the best people they can be, the best humans they can be. And I think when we talk about what we want in our leaders, those qualities, those characteristics, they're the same kinds of characteristics we hope will develop in our children.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of overlap.
We had a nice conversation about even how the child is constructing what leadership means. That abused child that you mentioned, it's leader, person in authority, person using force, and that's how they begin to think about. Or even, my daughter made a diorama for class the other day, and it had her as president with her 3 issues for a platform. Just the fact that she constructs in her mind right now that she could be the president. And she dressed up and she did her presentation about being the president of the United States, I imagine is fundamentally different than it would have been 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think that matters. That has a major impact. So I love the long lens view. I love that framing of this whole conversation.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the things that that's important for leader development. I think a third thing, and you touched on this already, is we need to incorporate developmental theories. And you mentioned Keegan, but there are theories of adult development, theories obviously of child and adolescent development too that are important, but adult development theories. There are theories of learning that need to be incorporated, and you and I are talking about working on a project related to that. And it's almost as if and I think this is what Barbara Kellerman was getting at when she sort of criticizes in the End of Leadership. She criticizes the leadership industry, right? Is we sort of pull it out of thin air and say, here are some strategies and here are some programs and practices that will develop leaders, and don't realize that all of that development is embedded in human development and theories of learning. And so we need to not, just do this sort of willy-nilly, but do it in a way that's consistent with what we know about how people learn and how people develop.
So Ron, I would love to know now, and you've mentioned a couple things that, look, we just need more work in this space, whether that's followership. We need more work in this space, or we need more work connecting learning to leader development, or adult development theory to leader development. What other pathways do you see for someone who's listening to this podcast and maybe they want to go on and they want to do research in this space? What are some really, in your opinion, ripe domains for exploration? You have such a command on this whole literature base.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm not doing this to plug my own work or whatever, plug a book, but I edited a book, and actually, I don't even have a full chapter in that book, but it's called "What's Wrong with Leadership," And that was exactly the question we asked. And it was Bob Lord and a bunch of us Bob Lord had brought us together, but Olga Epitropaki and Birgit Shins and Susan Murphy and Stephanie Johnson, and we were all meeting on some research, and we started to talk about, sort of what were the limitations and what were the opportunities in leadership research. And out of that, came this book, right? And so in that book, there's a chapter that that criticizes leadership and says it's too male centric, and we've sort of left women out of the picture. It's too Western centric, and we've left, for example, Eastern philosophies out of the picture. There are some methodological chapters in there that talk about, Fran Yamarino and his levels of analysis, that we're not taking into account the fact that leaders are embedded in context, in teams, and in relationships with followers, and so it occurs at multiple levels. And near the end, and then there's obviously a chapter on that Susan co-authored on we haven't started early enough, the development things that we were just talking about. And then it kind of ends with sort of big picture ideas of, why do we care about leadership anyway, and leadership for what? Because a lot of times we study leadership in almost like in a laboratory, and we don't think about, well, why do we care that there be better leaders? Because we want them to do something. We want them to transform the world, to change the world, make it a more positive place. And so that idea of leadership for what? So I think, there we thought about all of these sorts of things. So just now that I've thrown a million things out there, I mean, I think we really do need to attend well to followers and followership. We're putting so much of our resources, our time, our money into leader development, and not thinking very much about the development of the followers. We're sort of leaving it to the leaders to do the follower development, but to do it by making themselves better leaders, and then hoping that it's like a trickle down effect. And
Sure.
it's a little bit like trickle down economics, right? There isn't evidence that enough trickles down. And so I think really seriously looking at leadership development. How can we increase leadership capacity in teams, in organizations, in collectives? I think that's the big challenge, rather than just focusing on it like we're sending these leaders to school. How can we develop the whole community?
Because then, at least through that lens of how Kellerman was looking at it, leader-follower context, maybe the followers, there'll be enough of them to challenge the leader when that individual is going off track.
Yeah.
That they have the social capital, and that they have what's the word I'm looking for? Bravery, that they have a collective shared understanding of character to hold the leader accountable when he or she is moving off track.
Yeah. I mean, the best subtitle of any book is Ira Chalif's, The Courageous Follower, standing up for and to our leaders, right? That's the subtitle. And the idea is, when the leader's on the right track, you stand up for your leader, you support your leader. When your leader's on the wrong track, you stand up to them. And, and that's the hard part, and that's where the courage comes in.
Yeah. Ron, we are going to close out here, and I have a little bit of a lightning round for you.
Okay.
And so the lightning round is really just 3 questions, not necessarily related to what we just discussed, but it might be. So what are you streaming right now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I stream work-related things all the time, and so there's nothing particularly there that stands out. But with the lockdown and the COVID situation, my wife and I have discovered Netflix. I almost never watch TV, and my adult wife. And now all of a sudden, we're streaming these shows like Broad Range, from Ozark to, going back and looking at some early things. I'm actually streaming right now. We're streaming this old show, HBO show called Deadwood, which is about the Wild West, and you see examples of really bad leadership there.
And in Ozark.
And Ozark too. Ozark had the Ozark side, yeah.
Is there any podcast that you particularly enjoy, or are you listening to a book or reading a book that's really stood out for you?
terms of books, well, actually, I got an advanced copy of, and Stephanie Johnson, an advanced copy of her Inclusify book, because one of the things I've been interested in the last couple of years is the idea of inclusive leadership, and actually have a book. I'm doing a lot of plugging, but I edited a book with Bernardo Ferdman and Janine Prime called Inclusive Leadership, an edited book. And that's going to be coming out. So to read Stephanie's Inclusify was really good because she's pulling it down more to the everyday practitioner level of how do we get to become more inclusive organizations. And so I think that comes out next month, that book.
Great. And what was I haven't looked at the Facebook yet today. What was your quarantine song of the day?
I recycled one, but accidentally. It was my daughter suggested it, and it's Depeche Mode, "Shake the Disease," and I already used that. But the idea of when are we going to get out of quarantine? Well, not until we shake the disease. So my quarantine song of the day, and given how long this may go on, I'm going to have to really work to find more songs about being isolated.
Message in a bottle.
I'll add that to the list.
David Gilmour's On an Island. We could do this for a long time.
Yeah. Hey, send me some, because you know what? This is going to go on for a long time, and I'm going to need more of them.
So Ron, I said friendly, I said prolific, and I said music. And I really, really appreciate your time today. I know that our listeners will really enjoy hearing the wisdom that you have shared. I really enjoyed the conversation, have made some really interesting connections. And that's been one really fun thing about this whole project, is that I've had really fun conversations with individuals with multiple perspectives on the topic. And so it's just been a true joy, especially spending some time with you today. So be well, take care, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Scott. Great spending time with you.
I really enjoyed my time with Ron Riggio. I could literally sit and talk and listen to him for hours, and I hope all of you felt the same. He is just such a source of wisdom on this topic. And so a couple things that are standing out for me. So his distinction between the difference between effective and good. He also really focused on followership, and it's an area that was pioneered in part by Ira Chalef, and he speaks of the courageous follower standing up to and for our leaders. And I'm excited to have Ira and Sharna Fabiano on a future episode. Followership is a ripe domain for exploration. Why do men and women follow tyrannical leaders? And that was a really interesting dialogue. I really hadn't thought about that as even a topic after years and years and years of studying leadership. And then when it comes to leader development, he talked about the importance of mindset, but he also talked about it's kind of like a gym membership. You got to go, you got to show up. And I've talked about this in the past, but do you have a mindset that really everywhere you go, you have a practice field? For those of you who are listening at work right now, you have a practice field to practice leadership. And if you construct in your head that there's an opportunity for you to practice today, providing an inspirational speech, navigating a difficult conversation, visioning, all ripe opportunities for practice. And speaking of opportunities, I'm always amazed, and Ron made this very, very clear, that leadership is an area ripe with opportunity. So for those of you who are practicing, for those of you who are researching and studying the concept of leadership and followership, there are so many different paths, so many unknowns, yet, as Ron suggested, there are some knowns at this point. You have been listening to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast. If you liked what you heard, please share it with others and let them know what we're up to. And one last quick reminder to click subscribe so you know when we publish new episodes. And of course, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can stay in touch with me by visiting www.scottjallen.net or any number of social media platforms. Be well, be safe, and make a difference wherever you are on this beautiful planet. And now, here's Kate's twin sister, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.